Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity. My phone is actually ringing, so I have to turn that off. All right. Welcome to episode 9 of Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity. Today, our guest is Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost. Before we get started, excuse me. Sorry, life in the COVID era, right? Before we get started, I have to thank our anonymous donors who make this series possible. I'm sorry, I apologize. Excuse me just a second. Okay. Are you hearing that sound on the other side of the phone, Carrie?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. I'm not sure how to stop this, but anyway. All right. Let us try again. Welcome to episode 9 of of Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity with Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost. We'd like to thank our anonymous donors. We would like to invite you to visit our webpage at fordham.edu/orthodoxy. As well as our online editorial forum known as Public Orthodoxy, which Dr. Frederick Frost has written for a few times. We keep this pretty casual. I'm going to introduce Dr. Frederick Frost, and then we're just going to hear about her work and the really amazing contributions that she's making to Orthodox Christian studies as a whole, and particularly to theology. I believe you're the first bona fide theologian we're interviewing in this series, and we're very happy about that. So Dr. Frederick Frost is adjunct professor in the Global Humanities and Religions department at Western Washington University, and in theology at Saint Sophia Ukrainian Orthodox Seminary. She is the author of Maternal Body, the Theology of Incarnation from the Christian East, Paulist Press 2019, and editor of The Reception of the Holy and Great Council, Reflections of Orthodox Christian Women, which was published by the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in 2018. Her work attends to matters of women and mothers in the church, sacraments and practice, the reinstitution of the ordained order of the Deaconesses, Christian material culture, and contemplative prayer. She serves on the boards of the International Orthodox Theological Association, known as Iota, and the Saint Phoebe Center for the Deaconess, two organizations that I hope we have time to discuss, because they're fabulous organizations and you have such a leadership role in both of them. So we'd like to hear more about that. So if any of you, if this is the first time you are attending one of these webinars, I'll point you to the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a little Q&A tab. And you can click on that tab and type in your question. Carrie and I are just going to talk. We're friends, so I call her Carrie. So, Carrie and I are just going to chat maybe for half an hour, 40 minutes or so about her work, and then we will get to your questions. So queue them up as you have them, and we will try to get to as many as we can. One other thing I'd like to note, it wasn't in the official biography that we listed. But one other role that Carrie is about to embark on is she is going to be beginning in the next year. She's going to be beginning, I have the same problem here. She's going to be beginning as the book reviews editor for the Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies. So we're very excited about that. So Carrie, after all of those technical interruptions, because our phones are connected to our laptops and everything else, please tell us about how, you as an American woman got interested in Orthodox theology, and to the extent that you pursued an academic career in it, because it's not that often that that sort of thing happens. So just tell us a little bit about how you got into this.
Absolutely. So first of all, let me say thank you for having me, George. I feel that I've really been included in this illustrious company with the women that have preceded me in the series. They're so credentialed, they're so wonderful in their scholarship. So I feel honored to be included in this group. And I also feel that you've created something really wonderful with this series. You've created this place for deep conversation. I've listened to all of the webinars. I've enjoyed them so much, even with the women that I know already and consider to be colleagues and friends. I've learned from these conversations. I've learned about their personal journeys and their journeys to scholarship. It's been so interesting. And especially in our tradition where, and this speaks to my own work, so much of our narrative space is given to men's stories and men's journeys and men's scholarship. It's so special that you've created this space to listen to women's stories and listen and learn about women's scholarship. So thank you to you and to Telly and to the Orthodox Christian Studies Center and to the people in the background at the Orthodox Christian Studies Center and at Fordham, and to your anonymous donors for doing this. I appreciate it.
Of course.
And as for me and my own journey to being a scholar of Orthodox Christian theology, I think there are a few waypoints. Certainly growing up in the church. I grew up in the Orthodox Church. I grew up in southern West Virginia in a Carpatho-Russian parish, a lovely little parish there dedicated to the Dormition of the Mother of God. My father's family immigrated from Belarus. My grandparents came and ended up in the coal fields there in West Virginia. And my mother's side of the family was not originally Orthodox, although she and her mother later converted. And I would say a few things about growing up were very formative to me as a scholar. One was the liturgy itself, was growing up and just being in the liturgy, looking around, seeing the icons, venerating icons, smelling the incense, the sensorial experience of the liturgy itself, even without a lot of explanation, frankly, growing up, but just being in it. And things like, I remember at a young age having like favorite lines in the liturgy, in Vespers listening for the lines from the Psalms about the stork and the fir trees and the badgers and the wild goats. Like I would thrill when we would get to those moments because those, as they can do, stoked my imagination. And those sorts of things were undoubtedly formative for the way I think as a scholar today. I also think that I was an asker of questions as a child, and I had lots of questions about the church. I had questions about women, but also about other things. And I was fortunate that I was allowed to ask those questions. Now, the answers to those questions were not always satisfactory to me, and they didn't always line up to something that I noticed. Like I would get different answers from different people, especially on the questions about women and the church. But I was allowed to ask them. And especially
when you say allowed to ask, if I can interrupt, do you mean in family context, from your parish priest, from Sunday school teachers? You mean from everybody, or some of that?
I mean from the people in the church that I knew, older people in the church, the different priests that I knew, and especially within my own family, I would say, especially with my parents. There was an environment fostered where it was okay to ask questions. It was okay to be uncertain and to be questioning, to be wanting to know more. And this was especially true when my mother converted. She came to Orthodoxy when I was a teenager. And it's a really interesting thing to watch a parent, convert and to come to the church and to actually be a part of that process, because she too had questions, and she had questions about women in the church at that time. And it was actually during that process that a priest told us about Saint Phoebe and about St. Paul mentioning this woman, Phoebe, as a deacon of the church in his letter to the Romans. And I remember him saying to us, there were deaconesses in the church, and there were ordained deaconesses in the church, and maybe there will be again someday. And I have no doubt that that comment, was formative to me in my life and in my scholarship. So that environment of being able to ask, even if things weren't always clear in the answers, was certainly a formative thing for me. And my parents in general, they were pious people. They were people who were dedicated to their community. They lived in service in their community. And they also addressed things that were wrong. They were dedicated to addressing things and making them right. And then I think the next waypoint for me was my undergraduate work. I went to the University of Virginia, and I found myself in the religious studies department there. But what I studied was Tibetan Buddhism. And that was a source of perplexity for my parents, both because it was Tibetan Buddhism and also because it wasn't like engineering or science, which was, my father was an engineer, and it was hard for him to kind of comprehend anything other than those sorts of themes. Right. But for me, studying Tibetan Buddhism was actually a very, very formative and very critical thing, to go and study a tradition that was very, very different from my own. And I spent some time in Tibet, and to go and study a people and a culture and their religious practices, and to see the ritual and to see the contemplative practices that were so different from my own, gave me a completely different perspective on Orthodox Christianity that was so helpful. It was helpful in terms of scholarship over time, and it was also helpful because it made me appreciate my own spiritual personal inheritance as a young person in a way that I'm not sure I would have been able to otherwise. And the other thing that it did is that it opened my eyes to the possibility of an advanced degree, honestly. Yeah. It opened my eyes to the possibility of a Ph.D. in the humanities. Right. I had professors who really took an interest in me and saw me as a scholar. And this was not something that was in my cultural milieu in Southern West Virginia, the idea of doing an advanced degree in the humanities. So that avenue, opened up to me as an undergraduate, which was a real gift for me.
And
so, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I have a few questions, but if you have more to say, go ahead.
Well, then I was just going to say that I took time off actually in between undergraduate and graduate. I had some professors encouraging me to do Tibetan studies as a graduate student, but I was not so sure that's what I wanted to do. So I left. I did other things. I did completely unrelated things to academia. I made maps for an intergovernmental agency. I did like totally unrelated things. And I got married and had my first 2 children. And then over time, I really started to feel, I would say, called, I would say like vocationally called to go back to graduate school and in fact to study Orthodox Christian theology. And so I found my way back, and I actually went back to the University of Virginia where I had done my undergraduate work, but this time to study Orthodox Christian theology. And it was the presence of the theologian Vigen Guroian there at the University of Virginia that allowed me to study Orthodox Christianity so closely there at the University of Virginia. Had he not been there, I just would not have had the support there that I needed to do that otherwise. And so I did a degree, a PhD in theology, ethics, and culture at the University of Virginia. Okay. Again, very focused in Orthodox Christian theology. And that is pretty much the story in a nutshell of my path to that scholarship.
Yeah. Well, yes. So, you went to Virginia, I didn't, right? So you could tell me more about it, but looking from the outside, because I also did my PhD at a state school in the South, right, at UNC. And one of the things, at least from a distance, that always fascinated me about Virginia was that even though it was a state school, it actually had a place for theology in a way that other big high caliber state schools don't. So can you say just something about what made Virginia unique and having Vigen there especially?
Right. As I understand it, that's some of the legacy and the history of that department was having a couple different endowments at critical points in time. And I think that department has actually evolved and changed since even I have left there. Okay. That has maybe made it less likely to be able to do the kind of work I was even able to do when I was there.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interestingly, yes.
Yeah.
So I think there was a time period where maybe some things were possible that aren't even quite possible anymore. So, and I do think that, you know, I feel like there's a sense in which I got away with something almost, actually, at the University of Virginia. I mean, honestly, in that, because vegan was there, again, I was able to focus so specifically on Orthodox Christianity. You know, how many people ever in the history of the University of Virginia were able to go and do this degree and come out with this specialty. I don't know who else really quite. So I was able to like make something, and you know, I give the department so much credit though, the religious studies department there, because they were willing to work with me and understood, in fact, that there was this moment in the department's history where they had a specialist and they had a graduate student who wanted to do something. And so they actually carved out a space for me to do the work I wanted to do. So I do want to give them a lot of credit for being willing to create something there that allowed me to do the work I wanted to do.
And, you know, I mean, honestly, of people our age, right? I assume we're in the same ballpark of age, right? There honestly are not that many women theologians, right? Did you, like, I can just imagine how many times you were told, you can't do that. Why are you doing that? Should you do that? Right? I mean, I assume that happened. Did it happen that you kind of would run it, like you would meet a priest for the first time, you tell them what you're studying or what you're doing, and they just kind of look askance? Did you have that experience?
You know, this has happened to me not just in the church, but in the academy too. I mean, this happens in both places, I would say. Yes. Yes is the answer.
Yeah, we can leave it there, right?
Just leave it there. Yes.
All right.
On the other hand, I would say in many cases I have been welcomed, right? There's probably just as many cases where there's a sense of absolute welcome and hospitality of, we're so glad you're here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's, if we can, let's transition and talk about your book, which I just made my way through again, which is just, it's fabulous, right? So here it is, right there, Maternal Body, a Theology of Incarnation from the Christian East. And so for anybody watching the recording later who doesn't know, right, this is, well, actually, you tell us, where did this book come from, rather than me explain it? Why don't you tell us about the book and where it came from and what you're doing?
Sure. It has an origin story. So,
yeah, it really does.
It does. So when I was doing my work, my Ph.D. work at the University of Virginia, I was almost through my coursework, and my husband and I were thinking about maybe having a third child. We were like kind of having these kind of precious conversations about this. And so I was pregnant, and I went to go to a routine ultrasound, and at this ultrasound found out that we were having not just our third child, but our fourth and our fifth children. You know, we found out that I was pregnant with triplets. And so this is like as shocking as any news as you really can ever receive. And I like to joke that we all process this in different ways. Like my oldest son at the time was 8, and he kind of thought about it, and he said, we're going to need a bigger house. He lived in a really tiny house at the time, and he's very practical. My reaction was to write this book. And, you know, that's a long story short, but it's really quite true in that I had this very personal reaction that I needed to find out more about our tradition's theological thinking about motherhood. And so I went on this quest to do that. Like, that was really part of my reaction to this pregnancy, was I need to know more. And so I went looking for kind of theological treatises on motherhood, and guess what? And a tradition that is largely written by theological treatises are largely composed by celibate men. There really aren't any. And so I found other sources to work with. And we can talk more about those other sources. But I worked with those sources to compose this book. And some of those sources were quite lovely, and I wanted to share them. And they had all sorts of theological thinking about motherhood in them. And some of them contradicted some of our church's theological teachings about the body and about our incarnational theology. And I wanted to work with those too, and think about how we need to repair those or work on those. And then in the bigger picture, my own experience of motherhood, as well as what I was seeing in these sources, was that motherhood is embodied. You know, it is so inescapably and uniquely physical in this unequaled way in human experience. And it seemed to me that there was value there in using motherhood to reflect on our embodied experience as humans, to contribute to our incarnational theology, that it was a fresh way to reflect on our embodied reality. And so that's really what this book is all about in the big picture. And in this way, one thing I really want to point out is that my work in this book and elsewhere about deaconesses and about the churching rite and other things is really not about women's issues, you know, in a sort of narrow way, because these kind of matters about mothers' bodies, about women's bodies, and women's lives are really about who we all are, actually, as human beings, and all of our bodies. And these things take up things like how we understand sin, and how we understand our freedom, and how we understand our relationship with God. So these are universal human issues. They are, in fact, cosmic issues.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things you kind of end on with the book is it's precisely this point, right? If people perhaps in the past have not been as attentive to the fact that when they say particular things about the impurity of the maternal body or this or that, they don't realize that the kind of second degree implication is that either Christ wasn't incarnate or that, right. In other words, when you're talking about when you say things about mothers or motherhood, they don't realize that actually sort of implicates what we say about the incarnation, about God's becoming human, about him using a mother as the vehicle for all of that, right? And it's such a profound theological insight. One of the things there are a couple of things I love about the book, right? One of the things you do in the book is you set it up in the process of, right, of what it is to be a mother, right? Conception, pregnancy, delivery, postpartum, nurse, right? The whole thing, like the book follows that path and then delves off into theological questions, right? And then the other, right, like I'm telling you, you have to buy this, like everybody who's listening, right? Buy this book for anybody who is an expectant mother and a person of faith, because it is just such an unbelievable companion for that sort of thing. But then the other thing that I love about it is precisely as you say, there aren't that many sources, right? Monks in the desert, right, didn't really take a whole lot of time. They hadn't seen women in years to begin with. They didn't take a whole lot of time to think about the maternal body, right? They didn't take a whole lot of time to think about these things. But that doesn't mean that our church didn't, because they did. And it's in the iconography, it's in the hymnography, right? And that's what this book really pulls to the fore. Can you say a little more about that?
Right, sure. So yes, the biological process, as George said, the book is structured based around this. You know, I could have chosen many other ways to structure this book, right? I could have chosen different sort of preset, typical theological categories. But instead, the chapters are conception, pregnancy, birth giving, postpartum, and breastfeeding. And I did this because, again, the premise of the book is that the maternal body is uniquely evocative of our embodied reality. And so by using the biological process to structure the book, that gives me this opportunity to underscore that and explore that as I go along. And so, for example, with the pregnancy chapter, you know, I open the chapter by talking about the reality that is pregnancy, you know, that a woman experiences during pregnancy. I talk about some of the biological, like, nitty-gritty that's experienced during pregnancy. And I do this in a reverent way. And part of that is that, you know, often it's not done in a reverent way. You know, there are times in our larger culture. There are times even in the church that we fail to address these moments in maternal experience in a reverent way. And so I'm doing a little retrieval there and honoring these things for the way that they are in fact sacred. And then another part of this too, this structuring things in a biological process, is I am bringing in a little bit of my own story. I mean, this book is by no means focused on my own story. It is not a memoir by any stretch, but I do every now and again bring in a little personal bit of my own experience of this very physical part of motherhood. And I'm doing that because, first of all, this book is so like inextricably bound up in my own experience, as I explained in its origin story. But part of that is to witness, is to witness women's experiences, which have been underrepresented in our tradition. So it's not that my experience is like so interesting or special, but it's to witness that a woman wrote this book. And another thing too is that the biological process structure of the book is to witness the fact that the pursuit of knowledge is embodied. When we create books like this, when we pursue scholarship, we actually do it in an embodied state. And I think that, especially in the academy, we have this idea that like the intellectual endeavor is disembodied, that where we do this in our minds, but we do it in our bodies, it is in fact an embodied process. And so this biological structure to the book is a way to honor that as well.
Yeah, great. One last thing on the book, and then we'll go on to a couple things, which a couple other things, which is that I think the one place you really make a theological intervention is with respect to the 40-day churching prayers, right? And at least in their current form, the current form as they're published, they are theologically inconsistent, and you point out that they're actually, in Orthodox terms, modern, right? And so, what can you say a little bit about that, and why you're doing it, and what you're hoping to achieve by kind of making this sort of intervention?
Right. So the 40-day churching prayers are what we have today to when a woman, after she's given birth, she comes back to church, and on or around 40 days, some people are sticklers for exactly the 40 days, sometimes it's around then. These prayers are prayed when she returns to church for the first time. And on one hand, these are hospitality prayers to welcome her back to her church community, but they do include some language. They include some language that associates impurity and uncleanness and defilement. It depends a little bit on the translation, and childbirth. And this language is just inconsistent with our theology. I mean, it just does not hold water when we compare it to our understanding of these things. So it is theologically inappropriate language. So, and as George said, it's sort of new in our understanding of time. And so how do we deal with that? What do we do with that? And it's interesting because a few different churches have actually already started to deal with that. The Antiochians here in North America just a couple years ago published a new services of initiation book where they gave priests the option of dropping this language. They sort of put it in parentheses, so it's very easy for a priest when reading these prayers to just, immediately drop this language, and they included an explanation for it, that sort of thing. Other bishops have given priests blessings to alter the language as they see fit, to either make annotations and change the language or change it on the fly, to go ahead and change it. Other bishops are in the process now of working through new services of initiations that will actually alter this language altogether. So we see several different things happening, and I think a real acknowledgement actually right now here early in the 21st century of this language being inappropriate and being spiritually harmful. When we're in the process of welcoming women back to church, especially when this is the time when most women are actually kind of re-emerging into life after childbirth. They're beginning to maybe go back to work or go back to the grocery store or whatever. Let's do our best to frame that re-emergence spiritually, and to frame it by the church rather than like the post office or whatever. Let's frame that whole experience in this sacred way as it should be, and let's get it right. Yeah. And not have this damaging language in it. And so I think there are ways we're seeing this happen, and I think we'll continue to see that happening. And that will be a really wonderful thing, to be able to welcome women back to church in a rite of hospitality that celebrates the wonderful gift that is new life and that is motherhood.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. One of, I forget now, maybe it was 2018. Does that sound right to you? You did a piece on this particular topic for Public Orthodoxy. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the most read piece we had that entire year. Right. It was, wow. It really touched a nerve that needed to be touched. So this is
important. This is important.
Right. Okay, I want to talk about the Saint Phoebe Center, and I want to talk about Iota. What do you want to talk about first?
Let's talk about the Saint Phoebe Center, since you said
okay. All right. So I know you're on the board, but I don't know if you have an official title there. So if you do, tell us what your role is with Saint Phoebe and what Saint Phoebe does.
I'm a board member of the Saint Phoebe Center, and the Saint Phoebe Center is a nonprofit located here in the United States. And it is a group of people working together to educate and advocate for the revival of the ordained deaconesses, of the ordained female diaconate in the Orthodox Church. And so that is the work of this group of people. And we do this through all sorts of events. We have conferences, we have small publications, we had a series of webinars over the summer. We have things coming up, like we have a network that we're going to announce in the coming months, because we keep hearing from people that they want to be able to do more at a grassroots level, to be able to do things at their parish level, have book groups and have community meetings and that sorts of things. So we're going to support people who want to do that, because what we're hearing is that more and more that there's more of a movement and an interest across the United States, and from my perception, really across the broader Orthodox community around the world, that people are ready to move forward to see deaconesses ordained again today in the Orthodox churches. And so we're here to support, to educate, and advocate for this.
Yeah. So I've twice I've had the privilege of kind of being involved with events that you and other members of the board have done. I think I've served as moderator for at least for one of your panels, and hosted another or something like that. And what I've loved about those panels is that they're not aggressive, right? They're not. There's no hostility here, right? There's no, like, all of the caricatures that people might throw at groups like this. None of that takes place, right? And you've done a masterful job of kind of bracketing the different kinds of arguments, right? There's the historical arguments, right? What was the actual female diaconate in late antiquity and in Byzantium and elsewhere, right? And so that's that's an entire avenue that you can go down. What I've heard you most often contribute to is just the kind of the practical, ethical, on the ground pastoral role that the reintroduction of the diaconate could form, right? So since that's kind of your shtick with them, can you say a little, right? So beyond the historical argument, right? Just give us a couple minutes of what are the kind of practical pastoral roles that the reintroduction of a female diaconate could play in the United States, right, in the 21st century.
Right. Well, so here's my thinking in a nutshell. I think in some ways it's just really quite simple. I see the core mission of the Orthodox Church, of the Christian Church, really, to be a diaconal mission, to be a service mission. I think that's why we're here, to serve the world, to serve the church. And that means all sorts of things, right? That means to feed the hungry and take care of the poor, to encounter each other every day, whatever that means, in our families, in our communities. And that's things that all of us can do like in the next hour, right? In many, many ways. This means many, many different things. But in terms of the diaconate and in terms of deaconesses, this is something the institutional church can do now. It can begin to ordain women again to this particular major order. And here's why. I think that the church needs women's gifts. I think the church needs women's gifts because of who they are as unique human persons in this particular major order, to be able to share who they are, just what they have as unique persons. I think the church needs women's gifts because women have their own embodied experiences. Women have different realities than men. We experience the world differently, and the church needs those different experiences in this ordained ministry of the diaconate. I think the church needs women's gifts because women need women's gifts. Women need woman-to-woman ministry. And this is one of those strong pastoral components of the deaconess. Women need that kind of woman-to-woman ministry in all sorts of moments in life. You know, it's everything from times of these sort of motherhood, maternal times of like miscarriage and pregnancy, to times in marriage, to sort of very personal female times where woman-to-woman ministry is like highly valued and really greatly missing from the church right now. This is not something that's, we in Enlightened America have grown out of. There's a reason that I'm in a women's book group today, right? This is something we still value as a culture and the church is missing out on right now. I think also that the church needs women's gifts because women have unique experiences of things. You know, women have unique experience of sexual abuse and things like that the church could benefit from. Women have unique experiences of the abuse of authority and the judicious use of it that the church would benefit from. Women have unique experiences of childbearing and family life and marriage and divorce that the church would benefit from. And women also have unique experiences of life-giving and life-sustaining that the church and really the planet would benefit from. And the whole church really needs women's gifts. Men need these gifts too. And the church needs these gifts, I believe, through ordination. You know, we understand ordination to the major orders and the Orthodox Church as gifts being truly infused through the sacramental blessing of ordination and the enlivening of these gifts by the Holy Spirit. We have absolutely women here in the 21st century doing amazing things in the church. The church has changed so much since I was a child in West Virginia. I see women engaged in incredible leadership roles. Here I am as a professor of theology working in an Orthodox seminary. I don't even know if that was happening when I was a child, not to my knowledge.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. There's so many ways that women are engaged in the church, but for women to be ordained and to have their gifts blessed in that particular way and infused into the sacramental life of the church would be in fact a different thing as we understand the major orders. Yeah. So that's my kind of nutshell thinking about deaconess.
Okay. I imagine the questions are adding up. I'm sure we'll probably get a couple questions about that. But before we turn to the questions, because not everybody who's tuning in, maybe they're tuning in for the first time, not everybody knows what Iota is. So tell us a little bit about Iota and your, because you have a major role with Iota. So tell us a little bit about that as well.
Sure. So Iota is the International Orthodox Theological Association. This is an international body of scholars. Yes, theological is in the name, but this is scholars of all different kinds, of all different stripes. It is historians, theologians, iconographers, sociologists, philosophers. It even involves professionals as well. So it is scholars in just the broadest sense. It is people who are dedicated to the life of the church and also have a dedication to a particular field of scholarship. who want to build up the body of church and promote conciliarity across the work that they're doing. And so this was started several years ago. My colleagues, Paul Gavrilyuk and Gail Wallachak, the three of us are on the board, and we held our first conference in Romania in 2019. We had over 300 scholars come and give talks, which, you know, surpassed our wildest dreams at that time, and was like this truly amazing experience to be in the presence of so many colleagues who were there. It's one thing to go. I love going to conferences. I'm one of those like academics who actually really enjoys conferences, but it's one thing to go. It's one thing to go to a conference and, you know, be with colleagues and have this intellectual shared experience. It's a different thing to go to a conference and have that intellectual shared experience and also have like the communion of the saints and literally experience the Eucharist and to have the shared body of Christ experience with your colleagues. It was a profound experience, and it is our hope to, you know, build up the church as well as our scholarship and to be able to share ideas and communicate with each other over time. So that's Iota in brief, yes.
Okay, great. Have we picked a spot for the next one?
We are still thinking about the next one. So the plan is to have a mega conference every 4 years. So that would be 2023. So we're still thinking about that. In the meantime, we have a publication coming out that is commemorating our first conference that should be out early next year. And we have a few other projects in the pipeline that will be announced.
I know they've started a book. I mean, there's a website. There's an Iota website. Yeah. They're doing book reviews on the website. Yes. And no, it's like I can't say enough how spectacular this is. I mean, when Telly and other friends of ours, you know, were speaking with Paul and others about the idea and heard about it, I mean, we're like, oh, that's wonderful. You'll never pull it off. I mean, that's the thing, because we just know how hard it is to do something, and it's like it is simply unbelievable what was achieved. Like that conference in Romania was just absolutely spectacular in every possible way. For the local church was so unbelievably hospitable. Yes. The bishop literally brought every guest of the conference to his, I don't know what you would call
compound,
his compound, his house, his offices, whatever. I mean, it's all in one, right? And it was just, you know, it was the middle of winter in Romania, and but it was fabulous. It was absolutely fabulous.
Well, thank you. But what I do want to say is, it was the sort of thing where, like, clearly there was so much investment from all the different scholars who came, right? Like, it was an idea whose time had come, in the sense that so many people wanted to be there and wanted to have this opportunity, right? To be able to share ideas and to communicate. And so a venue was provided, and, you know, if you build it, they will come, sort of thing, where
but it required an extraordinary amount of coordination, right?
Work.
Yeah. I mean, it really did, because, well, let me just say this, right? Just so the viewers understand, right? Academics could have done this on their own, kind of easy, like much more easily than what you set out to do, because what you set out to do that made it different was you deliberately got all of the autocephalous churches, like the actual institutional churches, on board to endorse it. So it wasn't just a matter of finding scholars in Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, Russia, wherever, right? It wasn't just a matter of finding the scholars. It was a matter of coordinating the whole thing in such a way that kept the institutional churches involved at every level, despite the fact that they're constantly bickering with one another. And that was, you know, if there's evidence of grace in action.
Right. Well, and just to make a point clear there too, though, is that we are a nonprofit, so we are like our own institution. You know, we're not part of a particular church. But yes, absolutely, our goal is to have, you know, friendly and productive relationships with all of the churches, and again, promote conciliarity through scholarship as much as is possible.
Yeah.
And in the thick of what was happening in Ukraine, we had a session of scholars from all different positions of thinking about that very issue come and have a very lively and very respectful conversation at that moment in time.
In a very crowded room, as I recall.
In a very crowded room, which was more than the institutional churches themselves were able to do at that moment in time, right? Yeah.
No, it was fabulous, right? Okay, so Elizabeth Prodromou, who you know chimes in, and this is more. It seems like a comment than a question, but I'm going to read it anyway. Referring to the book, this is a brilliant book that combines robust scholarship with an evocative personal voice as a kind of religious anthropology of the body and motherhood. It's a book that must be read by Orthodox and non-Orthodox alike. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
All right, so let me get to a couple actual questions here. All right, so someone writes and asks, we're on the deaconess now, what reasons influenced the deaconesses to disappear in the Orthodox Church?
Right, well, I want to say that we don't have a crystal clear picture for exactly why. I think it's probably several things all at once. I think the encroachment of the Ottoman Empire is part of it, and part of that is, the role of the deacon in the church has always been this role of social and philanthropic outreach, and that was a key duty, and that was curtailed as the Ottoman Empire encroached, and so I think that decreased. I think as the monastic rite, the liturgical rites were increasing in the church at the time, that left less role for women in general. I think that's part of it. There was also an increase during this era of an interest in these issues of impurity that we saw as we talked about churching. And there were some connections made about women and places that they could serve and their ministries in the church at this time. So I think it was a kind of perfect storm, actually, of several things playing out over the course of a few centuries. And I should make clear that there's never been any sort of decree or canon or official limitation about this. Instead, there were just several sort of social and cultural things happening that led to a decline over time. Do you want to add anything to this, George, as the historian?
Well, I just say the thing that has struck me for the last few years as I've been thinking more and more about this, simply because you guys are prompting me to think more and more about it, is that if you know your history of Byzantine liturgy, you'll know that in Byzantium, there was a kind of monastic rite that was occurring, like what the liturgy looked like in monasteries was not identical to what the liturgy looked like in parishes or cathedrals. And when the Crusaders came in the 13th century and occupied Byzantium for 60 years, when the Orthodox reclaimed their churches, there was never again, at least in Constantinople, a cathedral rite. It was only a monastic rite. And the monastic rite, of course, would not have had female deacons. Why would you need them, right? It wouldn't have had female choirs. Why would you need them in all male monasteries? And so literally that kind of 60 years of, I've often thought that 60 years of colonization of Byzantium was really probably the nail in the coffin of an order that was probably, for the reasons you've explained, already diminishing. I floated this to a few people, scholars of liturgy, and they said, "Oh yeah, maybe," but I've never gotten more than that. So anyway, but I'd be eager to learn more. The same person asks, and I know this is really, I'm sure you've heard this a million times. Were deaconesses made by a laying of hands, herothesia, or by ordination, herotonia? Are you familiar with this?
Right.
Distinction, right? Everybody wants to make a big deal out of this. Can you explain first why they would want to make a big deal out of it and what the evidence is?
Right. So some of the question here is sort of a distinction between a minor order or a major order and whether this is an ordination, therefore, or not, or like a blessing versus an ordination kind of distinction. Yeah. And we certainly have ample evidence that they were ordained. The rites that we have, the textual evidence that we have, that there was a laying on of hands by the bishop during the liturgy at the altar, and the same place in the service that male deacons were ordained, that they were presented with a stole and a chalice, that they received communion with the major clergy, that much about the actual words and the rite was the same. So I think that there's a lot of clarity, and Valerie Karras and Kyriaki Fitzgerald, some of their work, and there's some other scholars as well. It's pretty clear from the scholarship, the historical scholarship that we have, that we're dealing with a major order's ordination.
Yeah, historically in Byzantium, right?
Yes, thank you.
Right. Yeah, so actually, something occurs to me now, actually, which is which people perhaps who are watching don't know, but might be interested in, which is the fact that in the church in Africa, the Orthodox Church, Patriarch of Alexandria in Central Africa has of late ordained women, but there's some question as to whether or not he has made them kind of full-fledged deaconesses, or if maybe something more akin to like a reader. Can you tell us what you know about this?
Right, and I don't think I would use the word ordained for this reason.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think that the word that he is using is blessed. So I think he has chosen to do, from my understanding, and I don't profess to have a crystal clear understanding, okay? But from my understanding is that he's chosen to do something that's more like a mix, it appears, that's during the liturgy, but not at the altar. So something that is kind of taking a little bit from both worlds. And my understanding is that there had been a hope that or an intention to do a full ordination, as we might understand it, but then there was some hesitation. And so therefore there was a kind of lessening of the ritual action that took place.
Yeah. And do you know how many he did? Or because I think he did a batch of them at first, but then I think he's subsequently done more. Is that correct?
So my understanding is that there were 5 in Congo, and this was 2017. And then since then, there was someone in Sierra Leone, and then maybe another person. Okay. But I have recently heard that now there is sort of been a at least temporary stop on any intention of going forward. And I don't have a lot of clarity. I mean, I'm speaking in a cagey way, not because I'm withholding anything, but because I just don't feel like I really understand what's happening in the Patriarchate of Alexandria. I just don't feel like I have a lot of information to share.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we have several more questions here about deaconesses.
But may I say just actually one more thing about that? So what I do think is important, and I think is worthy of like thinking about and consideration, is that the Patriarch of Alexandria did this at all. And I just want to highlight this, is that in 2017, Theodoros made this decision to do this. He made this decision to go ahead and consecrate women as deaconesses today in the modern world. And he did so to, in his words, have them do catechesis, have them be part of the formation of the community. And this is a really historical and noteworthy thing, because what we're seeing happen is we're seeing an autocephalous church make the decision to go ahead and revive this ancient order in some form. Yeah. So even, this may not be a full ordination, quote unquote. It's a particular way in a local community, addressing the needs of that local community, which is what, as far as we understand it, deaconesses were in the ancient world, to address local needs in a local community. So a precedent has been set here in our contemporary setting of an autocephalous church going ahead and reviving this order. So I do want to just mark that as a very noteworthy and interesting and fascinating development.
Okay, yeah. So kind of tying this in or blending it with some more of these questions that we've. I'm going to read you a couple questions and then just let you kind of comment further as you see fit. Right. So one is regarding the ordination of women deacons. What will persuade the bishops to give their blessing to ordinations? All right. So that's on the one hand, and then from someone else. Where is the movement for the female diaconate today? Has anything changed over the last few years? What are some of the markers that we should be recognizing and looking forward to in the coming years? And what would be the formal way that a woman would be ordained? Or example, from which archdiocese? And then somebody else asks, do you prefer the term deaconess to female deacon? It's all English, so. But anyway, so just, I guess, more, right? Like what's, like, do you, like, if ask you to play the role of prophet, right? You've already said, right, there's no proscription against this anywhere, right? In fact, canon law has plenty of regulations about what it will look like or what the diaconate looks like, but it doesn't have anything ruling it out. So theoretically, if I'm not mistaken, any autocephalous church could reinstitute this. Potentially, any bishop could do it without even asking his autocephalous leader. Now, I don't know that would actually happen, but so, yeah. So tell us what you think, right? What stands in the way of bishops doing this, or is this a group of people who know this subject a lot really calling for it? Or is this something that actually the broader church is asking for?
Right. Well, here, and, I'll give you my read on it. It's one person's read on it, and I offer it in humility. Okay. So, in theory, a bishop could, in theory, go tomorrow, I suppose, and ordain someone. But, I can't imagine that would possibly be a fruitful or helpful thing to do. So I would imagine an ideal would be that over time, a synod of bishops would come to this decision and come to it in a thoughtful and prayerful fashion. What I see happening, what I observe happening is in the past 5 years even, I see a much bigger conversation happening across the church. So I mean laity, I mean across the whole clergy, bishops that I speak to, priests that I speak to, deacons that I speak to. I hear this happening. I see it on the internet. I hear it in personal conversations. I hear it at the parish level. Our center, Saint Phoebe Center, gets a lot more inquiries. We have a lot more response from the conversations that are happening, just in terms of the scholarly thing, which the academia is not always a measure of what's happening in the church. So just to be clear about that.
But that's absolutely true.
No, it's not. But right. even at that level, there's more happening there as well. And so, for example, an example I'll put out there is just this past year, George and I were both involved. There was a document that was approved by the Ecumenical Patriarch and his synod, a social ethos document towards the life of the world that included a few statements in it about the revival of deaconesses in the church that condoned this possibility anew. That is a very significant thing, and I think that marks a new possibility for this era of the church, for that to be included in such a document at this moment in time. So I would cite that as a significant moment right now, indicating church-wide interest and readiness, in fact. So I do think in the past 5 years, there's like a new level of interest across the board. So that's what I would say. Now, I don't have the crystal ball, I don't know what will happen, but I do think whatever does happen will happen in a across the board sort of way. This is not something that just a bishop can decide, or can be a top-down sort of decision, or just a grassroots decision. Like, the entire church must go through this process together, prayerfully and with discernment and with love and without fear and with education and with hope and embracing the idea that this is for the building up of the body of Christ. This is to fulfill the mission of the church as a service mission. This is for the good of the church.
Yeah, thank you. I'll let people know that social ethos, you can read that social ethos document on the homepage of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. They have it in 15 languages or something like that. So that's there. And then a few people have commented in. I know many of the members on your board. They've wanted us to remind everyone that all of the documents, like the Saint Phoebe website at orthodoxdeaconess.org, has a kind of treasure trove of these historical documents, as well as the canons, various historical things, as well as just all kinds of information. So if you want to know more about what's available in English, it really is the single best site that I know of for this information. Again, that's orthodoxdeaconess.org. All right, okay. All right, I'm gonna give the last question to one of my former students, who's a mutual friend of ours, which is Joshua Saleh. He say, "Thanks, Carrie, for all this, immensely informative and timely. My question is about whether the Eastern Orthodox Church might be able to learn about the female diaconate by comparison with the trajectory of the female diaconate in non-Chalcedonian traditions, in some of which the female diaconate featured even more prominently, for example, the Syrian Orthodox Church, or where the ordination of women endured far longer, as in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where we have ample reports of deaconesses well into the 17th or 18th century." So would you like to comment on that? Or like, does Saint Phoebe, have you guys in the past worked explicitly with people from these traditions? And like, just, yeah.
We have not, but this is something we have discussed and we would welcome, and we have talked about more explicitly engaging with. And I say yes. I mean, I say yes, this is something we have so much to learn from. And, even just very recently, the Armenian Orthodox Church ordained, and I believe ordained is the correct term here. Someone correct me if I'm wrong here. Deaconesses anew. And there's so much to learn here, I think, from this sort of engagement and these sort of possibilities. And in general, I am someone who is all for engagement between the Eastern Orthodox and the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox churches. I mean, this is a space where I think there's so many possibilities, and so much hope and so much need for better connection and unity.
Yeah, well, let me just add, one of the things I know that they do in many of these traditions, especially in the Middle East, is they have female altar servers. So not even deaconesses, but they have, an overabundance of female altar services. And, one bishop who I've spoken about the issue of deaconesses with, who I have a great deal of affection for and respect, when I've sort of broached this issue of female deaconesses, he said, yes, I'm absolutely for it, but our parishes aren't even accustomed to altar girls. Right, and maybe we start there. I don't know that you share that opinion, but it does make a little sense to me, right? That if parishes would be jarred by seeing girls in the altar when they're not accustomed to it, then they would probably be more, despite all the pastoral reasons why we should do it. Anyway. Right.
Well, it's an interesting issue because children in the altar, and I don't know about the non-Chalcedonian tradition, but Orthodox tradition, this is not something that we have a particularly long history with. I mean, my understanding is this is something where our Protestant brothers and sisters have influenced us. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but this is something where we have, borrowed from other traditions, and therefore we have young boys in the altar. So this is not something where we have like a precedent that we're basing something off of in the first place, whereas with deaconesses, we have this incredible historical precedent. So it's just kind of an interesting comparison in the first place, right? And secondly, though, I would say that I absolutely do think that we need to think as a community about other things like female readers and female chanters and things like tantring female chaplains and ways that we have minor orders or things that aren't even technically minor orders, that we have men incorporated into our community and honored and called out in these specific ways, where there's absolutely no reason, that we would not incorporate women, but we just don't. And so there are ways that we could very easily, and honestly without, I think, very little feather ruffling or controversy in many cases, integrate women into these roles and see them and have some like visual familiarity and comfort with women in these roles that would be beneficial to all, beneficial to all. Yeah.
That's fabulous, Carrie. I think we'll call it a day there. It was really great. So a couple of quick housekeeping things. Please visit our website for the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham, which you can find at fordham.edu/orthodoxy. You can read some of Carrie's posts on public orthodoxy. We need to get you to write for public orthodoxy again. It's been a few months at least. And read her book, buy her book. I'm happy to announce our next episode 10 will be one of my teachers, the very famous Dr. Elizabeth Clark from Duke University. And we've just set that for October 27th, I believe at noon, but we'll be publicizing that. So we'll be very excited to have her. I'd like, again, to thank our donors. I would especially like to thank you, Carrie. Always good chatting with you. Look forward to working with you on the journal going forward. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in.